Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Rabbi.
We'll get started in about a minute or so. Just to take people's temperature on a different topic. So Rabbi Zach is planning on starting a shear after the break in early January. And based off of his schedule, he was eyeing to do the slot basically right before this. So it'd be like I think 7:30 or something, or 7:15 to 8:15, something like that. Now I am not married to Tuesday. Like I can do this shear on Monday nights or Thursday nights. And if those dates do or don't work for you in a way, I guess let me know, because it will affect whether or not how we kind of figure out the next process of this post-January situation. Because I have more flexibility in the evenings, and Rabbi Zach was only able to do it on Tuesday, I think. So figuring out what makes sense, if people would prefer to have back-to-back, whatever works for people, is fine. But if you can give us feedback, that'll be helpful. I'll make the same announcement at the end of the class again for anybody who signs on. And maybe we'll try and send it to some people who come somewhat regularly but are not on for tonight. Okay, so let's get started. So tonight's topic is, the basic topic is why the mitzvah of Shmita exists. And so whenever you delve into the realm of Ta'amei mitzvot, and my goal with this topic is to introduce the concept of Shmita, and I'll give kind of the impetus for why I decided to go back to this topic. We spoke about it a little while back, and the reality is that my hope is that going through certain halachic sugyot in the next couple of classes will help us navigate some Shmita issues from a halachic vantage point. But before we got into that, I felt like it was necessary to spend a little bit of time on the why behind Shmita. And as I've said in the past, whenever I've talked about Ta'amei mitzvot, which means the reasons behind mitzvot, is that you're on tender ground. You're not on terra firma when you're talking about the why behind mitzvot. Very few mitzvot have a very clearly delineated why in the Torah. And even if they do, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's limited to that why. And so it's possible that we view mitzvot as multifunctional, that they have many ways and reasons why God commanded them, and our human capabilities of providing meaning and understanding, are helpful, but they should not be used as the reasoning for why not to do the mitzvot, certainly. And they also should be used only as a way of adding taste or flavor to the mitzvah, meaning giving it a little bit more connection to our everyday lives. So my hope is that by talking about the why of Shmita, it will give us a little bit of time to delve into this broader narrative of the Ta'amei mitzvot. Now, I will say that when it comes to Shmita, so first of all, we're in the middle of a Shmita year. Okay, Shmita years are complicated exactly how you calculate them, because different things start at different points in time, and then you're going from kind of the Jewish calendar to the secular calendar in terms of our understanding of when a year starts and doesn't start. We kind of get confused with all this stuff, right? We're about to have New Year's, but New Year's is irrelevant to Shmita, right? And the reality is that we actually got a text this week from the VAD that the packs of 3 peppers that you'll find in Kroger are stamped with products of Israel and Mexico. And it's a Shemitah year. So it's complicated to be able to purchase fruit or vegetables that were collected for the purpose of sale, right? Not only are you not allowed to sell those things, you're also really not supposed to buy those things. And so that creates a little bit of just a realization for us that we should just be aware that if we see vegetables have the label that they are made in Israel, even though most of the time we want to specifically buy those products to support the Israeli economy and the Israeli farmers, when it comes to the year of Shemitah, it gets complicated. And so, as best as possible, we should avoid engaging in business with those types of items. From what I understand, the loose peppers are fine, and many of the peppers will just say products of Mexico, and those are fine too. But it's just something that we have to keep in mind. And for that reason, I decided, you know what, it's good to go back and do a little bit more Shemitah topics in the not so distant future. So for tonight, again, the question is, what is the tam? What is the reason or the flavor behind the mitzvah of Shemitah, which basically is that every 7 years we let the land of Israel lay fallow. We do not work the land. We make sure. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Because my computer's saying trying to connect, so I'm not sure what it's trying to connect to, but hopefully everything's fine. So so we let the land lay fallow every 7 years, and you're not allowed to work the land. You're not allowed to do business with the produce that I got kicked off for a second, so let's backtrack for a second. Okay, so my internet has been very funky the last 24 hours or so. I'm not sure why. If that happens again, okay, hopefully it won't happen again. Okay, let's try this one more time. Hopefully third time's the charm. Are we good again?
Yeah, we're good now.
Okay, hopefully this lasts. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to shut down a lot of my. Just close some of these things. Okay, so Rav Hirsch again is operating in Germany, in Berlin, and he is in Frankfurt, and he is of particular importance again for the Jews in Germany a couple hundred years ago. Rav Shamshel Hirsch is as follows, and this is in Chorev, which is his big kind of magnum opus, which he writes on a whole host of topics. In externals too, Israel was supposed to be a people among peoples. For this purpose, God gave Israel its own place on the earth for its own special tasks. In order, however, that Israel's land, intended for the realization of Israel's tasks, should not, through the sin of pride of possession, become the cause of Israel's downfall, God ordained Shmita, Yovel, Bikurim, Truma, Meiser, and Chala in conjunction with Israel's own soil. So basically, we're chosen as this people of God that's supposed to communicate with the rest of the world in order to reinforce and project God's message as God will call oldest son, right? As basically the Bechor of the nations, that our goal is to be the helpful voice for God in this world to spread the notion of monotheism. Now, one of the things that God gave us is a center, a land for us to live in, i.e., Eretz Yisrael. Now, the problem is that one might come to the wrong perspective, which is that, wow, look at us. We are really important. And so people should honor me. People should give me kavod. People should see me as this very important people, as opposed to us seeing our role as servants of God as being, at the end of the day, not something that's supposed to get us big heads, but something that gives us meaning and connection, and it should inspire others. But if it gets to you and turns you into this big-headed person, then that's going to undermine the whole enterprise. And so at the same time that God gives us the center, he gives us all of these rules that go along with it, including Shmita, Yovel, Bikurim, Truma, Meiser, and Chala. Shmita and Yovel affirm God as owner by right of all property. And so even though, God gave us Eretz Yisrael, it's really still God's land. And Shmita is meant to remind us that we're here for a reason, for a mission, and not just feel special and pat ourselves on the back. They also, through the prohibition of work on the land, express for the Holy Land the lesson which Shabbat conveys in connection to the lordship of the earth. So again, the Shemitah and Shabbat connection we'll see a number of times tonight, but in the same way that in the context of creation, God takes a step back and rests, and there's certain lessons to be learned about how we perceive work and what our major mission is in the world by God stopping from work to rest, and we continue to have that day of Shabbat. Similarly, Shemitah is meant to be a day that provides us with a reminder not to allow our status as the Jewish nation to get to our heads. And honestly, it's a very important thing to remember because, and not to be cliche, but the concept of with great power comes great responsibility very often goes hand in hand with, just because you have great power doesn't make you more important than everybody else. You can't take an approach where you're the only one who matters and everything else is not important. And that is unfortunately something that you'll sometimes find within the Jewish community. And Shemitah is supposed to be something that reminds us to avoid that perspective. So that's kind of the first thing in terms of our own character development as a nation in this case. But it also is true on a personal level. And this comes from the Sefer HaChinuch. Again, the Sefer HaChinuch is one of the books that really made Ta'amei HaMitzvot popular. And the Sefer HaChinuch, it's not 100% clear exactly who wrote it. There's a couple different possibilities. But regardless of who wrote it, the Sefer HaChinuch arrives on the scene, around the time of the Rishonim, the early Rishonim, 13th, 14th century. And the Sefer HaChinuch is one of many books of mitzvot that goes through the 613 mitzvot and delineates each mitzvah, the main takeaways. And one of the things that it does is it talks about the sharshei ha-mitzvah, the roots of the mitzvah. And when talking about the sharshei ha-mitzvah, what are the roots of the mitzvah? So the Sefer HaChinuch will talk about basically the tamei ha-mitzvah, What are the reasons perhaps behind the mitzvah? And the Sefer HaChinuch gives multiple reasons for many mitzvot. And tonight we'll see 3 different reasons from the Sefer HaChinuch over the course of the shir regarding Shemitah itself. The second of the 3 reasons is V'od yesh to'eles. There's also another reason for this mitzvah. Nimsa bedavar liknos bezemidas hitvatrut ranut. So to be a vatran. So to be mevater means to basically let go of things when people wrong you. So here, It's not exactly the same, right, translation, but here you're willing to let things go. You're not so possessive. You're not so controlling. You're willing to kind of let others lead, let other things happen without it being completely in your hands. Ki ein nediv kinose mibli tikva el hagmul, because no one is more generous than someone who gives without having kind of the thought process of getting repaid back, right? When people are willing to give without strings attached, when people are willing to give, let go without demanding control, that is a midah that is wonderful, that we are striving for, the midah of vatranut. And when someone can literally take their entire land and say, whatever grows is not mine, it's hefker, it belongs to God, and they can watch other people come into their land on that year and partake from that land and take the fruit and the vegetables and everything else and not say boo, that takes a certain development of your own personal vatranut. And so again, these two traits, one, not letting the chosen people status get to your head, realizing that it's a responsibility and not something that should cause you any gloating. And number two, that the ability to give without having strings attached, the ability to let go, the ability to let go of the control of the land for that year is a fundamentally important thing for us to develop. And again, we live in a world where we're more and more able to control so many things from the palm of our hand, right? We can control the Nest, right, thermostat in our house. We can control the vacuum cleaner from our phone. We can control our money, right, banking and sending things here, there, and the other place. And so we live in a world where we've become God-like in terms of our control over so much of our environment. And Shemitah is meant to be a reminder that at the end of the day, we don't control really anything. At the end of the day, we have to trust that God is in control. And as much as we put in our hishtadlut, we put in our 2 cents, we put in our time, we need to remember ultimately that God is running the show. Okay, so that's character development. And again, my categorizations, I have mixed feelings about them. I think you can mix and match, and you'll see some of these things kind of overlap in different ways, but there's slight nuances and differences, and so I kind of organize them the way that I did. The second kind of section is, again, basically just the Sefer HaChinuch, his third answer. And this is, you can find this in multiple places. I just happened to be that I did the Sefer HaChinuch today in preparation for this class. And so I felt like it was representative of a whole host of literature, but we're just going to use the Chinuch to kind of hold up this one, because I feel like it's this is probably the one that most people know and think about, but that is basically the assertion of faith, the assertion that Shmita is a way for us to practically demonstrate our belief in God. Right? That by doing the mitzvah of Shmita, by literally hanging up the hoe and the rake and everything else and the plow and putting it all away for a year, we are demonstrating and building a sense of trust in God. Ki kol hamotzi im levavo latet ulafkir li olam kol gedule karka osav, because anyone who comes with a full heart to make ownerless all of the things that will grow from their land, v'nachalas avosav, and this is an ancestral heritage, right? It's right in Israel, your land in theory is passed down from father to son all the way back to the Shvatim, right? And the people who first got the land. So this is you feel like this is your land, right? You feel like this is my ancestral heritage, and yet we have this law of Shemitah, which is to remind us that whoa, it is, but it's God's. Really, it's God's land. And if you do this, you yourself and your family every single year, or every single 7 years, right? And so there's 2 things here. You could have put this first line in section 1 about perfecting traits, but again, number 1 is that you're not going to have stinginess if you're, again, willing to give up your land, but also you won't have a lack of trust. The fact that you're willing to put yourself in such a vulnerable financial situation that once every 7 years you literally hang up your hat and say, okay, God, You gotta take care of me, right? That's intense. It's intense. And the truth is that the ability for people to do that today in a modern economy is very complicated. And farmers who, in fact, keep the mitzvah Shemitah to its fullest, in many ways are heroes, right? The fact that they're will. It kind of reminds me of the days when people, right, were struggling to find work because you couldn't find work that didn't work on Shabbos, and there were some people who literally refused to work on Shabbos, and they lost their job again and again and again, and it was very complicated how to make that work in the modern economy 60, 70, 80 years ago. Today, right? Thank God it's much easier for Shabbos. It's very in to be kind of religious in some way or another. But Shemitah is not so simple, right? If you make Jaffa oranges in Israel and you have distributors across the world that expect your Jaffa oranges on a Shemitah year, you say to them, well, we can't give you our oranges this year. They're going to find oranges somewhere else, right? They're going to find oranges somewhere else, and that could affect your ability to sell them the year after. And so it's a really complicated reality. And when people are able to fulfill this, it builds and shows, it both reflects and reinforces, right, a person's true faith in God running the world. So again, there's parallels here between this and, right, what we talked about in the Chorev, but still I put in a separate category because it's less about fixing a certain trait as much as it was about faith and us having a true sense of belief that comes out of the experience. Now, a couple of other things, and again, we're going to see overlap in some of the conversation again, but the concept of correcting common misconceptions is another issue that Shmita might be coming to instill. And again, this is an interesting argument as in general to give a reason for a mitzvah, because God wanted to correct certain false thought processes is really interesting, especially because it's a little bit of a historical, right, reading, as you'll see in a second, of the mitzvah. So it's interesting because it kind of shows you where the Sefer HaChinuch's head is at a little bit, but I have mixed feelings about this particular answer. So the Sefer HaChinuch's first answer of the three is as follows. Mesharshei HaMitzvah, the reasons behind the mitzvah. Likvoa bilvaveinu litzayer tzior chazak machshavosenu inyan chidush ha'olam. Right, so we're trying to communicate here or convey here a real strong sense of imagination about what the creation of the world once looked like, right? God worked for 6 days creating the heavens and earth, and on the seventh day, when he didn't create anything, he basically declared rest for himself. Rayonenu badavar hakadmus asher yaminu hakofrim batorah. And in order to remove the mistaken belief system that the earth, that the world, and that right, is actually an eternal structure, which is believed by certain apostates or how do you translate? Kofar, whatever, people just call him kofar, right? I'm blanking on the English word for someone who denies Torah and denies the possibility of God. It's not apostate, it's someone who
Epicurus?
Yeah, so same thing, but in English. Epicurus is not helpful. That's
heretic.
Heretic. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. So the and again, this is a reference to Aristotle, right? Aristotle famously was the philosopher who believed that the world, the earth, was eternal, and right, you don't have to deal with the beginning and there being a creator if the world always existed. And so that was the notion that we're trying to reject here, is that Shemitah is meant to remind us that actually, no, God created the world, made certain rules, and so we follow those rules as a way of highlighting that God created the world. And the 6 days of work and the 1 day of rest is parallel to the 6 years of working your land, and the 7th year you let it rest. Right, and through this belief they were able to break down all the doors and all the walls, meaning they were able to break down the various religious perspectives by saying, you know what, the earth is eternal. So so we have the obligation, the hotzi kol zmanenu yom yom v'shana v'shana al davar zelimnos sheishanim l'shavas b'shvius. We have this need to constantly be reinforcing the 6 days of work and the 7th day we rest, or the 6 years we work and the 7th year we rest, as a way of reinforcing the biblical narrative of there being a creation, being a beginning, to counteract, right, this false or wrong ideology. We should never forget about this. And this is parallel to the same thing we do by the 6 days of work and resting on Shabbat. So the same kind of takeaway message, says the Sefer HaChinuch, comes out of Shemitah as well. And that's why God said that we should make ownerless all things that come from the land in this year. Hashvisa ba kadesha yizkor ha'adam ki ha'aretz shemotzia alav haperos b'chol shana v'shana lo b'kochachta v'sgulta totziosam. That when you realize that when things do grow from your land, it's not by your hand that these things are growing, it's by the grace of God. Obviously, again, you have to put in the work and put in the time, but at the end of the day, is a realization that ultimately God is the one who runs the show. Adon Aleha, there is a master on it, Va'al Adoneha, and on its master, Kshihu Chavetz Mitzvah, meaning that it goes all the way up to God. Kshihu Chavetz Mitzvah Lav, Lavkir. And so we have this, we have this mitzvah on them, on people, on farmers to be mafkir, to give up the ownership of their land in order to demonstrate again that God is the one who created the world, God is the one who owns the world, and therefore we do this 6 in 1. And the truth is that it's really powerful when you think about it, right? Because when you think about a month makes sense because it's based off of the lunar cycle. A year makes sense, it's based off of the solar cycle. A week doesn't make any sense, right? There's no reason for a week. There's no reason for the 7-day period. And yet it's unanimous, it's ubiquitous. Everybody has a week, 6 days of work and then a weekend, or 5 days of work and then a weekend, but everyone counts it by 7 days. What's the deal? Right? And so in some ways, Sefer HaChinuch is saying that we do that. We reinforce the 6 in 1, the concept of 7, as a way of reminding us that ultimately God created the world. The world is not a eternal structure. Okay. Another idea comes from the Akedas Yitzchak of Arama. His first name was Moshe. No, so Yitzchak ben Moshe Arama. So he was a Spanish rabbi who wrote these treatises in philosophy. He called them Sha'arim, he called them gates, and they were basically like long sermons. And he did them based off the Parshios, and he has some very interesting topics that he covers in this work. So the Akedas Yitzchak says as follows. Again, Yitzchak ben Moshe Arama. Ein zerak ki benafshinu diber legalos es aznenu v'la'iris libenu v'atziv lanu tziyunim gedolim v'noraim lamid simanim rabim v'atzumim levkoach einayim oros hashkuos v'dimyunei ha'olam. So this is all for our souls to free our ears and to open our hearts and to paint these powerful images and to make signs, many great signs, to open our eyes again from the darkness, to lighten from the darkness, all the distractions of the world. Ki b'mispar sheva shnei ha'avoda v'shvisas hashvias He'eris libeinu lashmiya la'aznenu ki lo shulachnu hina le'yos avadim nimkarim la'adama. So, and here's the money line, right? That this in this number of the seven years, right? 6 years of working, and the seventh year we rest, we inspire our hearts and we have our ears hearing that we're not put on this world just to work, right? To be sold basically to the earth. But rather we have a higher calling, right, which is unbelievable and incredible. When we enter the land of Israel, it's not just to become subjects of the earth, to become men of the earth or women of the earth. It's right, that our whole goal should just be to collect what we need to collect. His point is that there's a higher goal, right? There's this spiritual journey, this spiritual goal, which is being reflected by Shemitah, which is being reflected by Shabbos. These are things that are meant to remind us that we're not just workers, that we have a higher purpose as well. Now, it's interesting, right? Some people have a very negative perspective on work, right? I was recently listening to he's not a very good person, and I don't agree with basically anything that he says, but it's always interesting to hear what people in different circles say. But Noam Chomsky, right, the anti-Semite, but he thinks that the way that our system is set up in America, that work is basically enslaving the masses, that basically we create a system that requires people to work, and by doing so, we are enslaving them with, right, the work. So Judaism views work very differently. We view work as redemptive. We view work as godly, but, right, there is this, and this is what the Keres Yitzchak is getting to, there is a limit, right? There is a higher purpose beyond work. That work can never be what you are limitedly, you're right. If someone asks you, right, so right, who are you, what are you, right? So some people might say, oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm a doctor, I'm a rabbi, right, based off of what your vocation is. But the truth is that more importantly than that is that you are a ben or bas Torah, right? You're growing. Your humanity, your soul is much greater and grander than whatever vocation you choose to do. And so the goal or the message that Keres Yitzchak is that don't get bogged down just by what you do or what you did or whatever that work is. That work is important. We don't demean the work. It's important, and we see a lot of dignity in work. Right, the highest level of tzedakah is to get someone a job, right, to help them work and pull themselves up financially. But work is not the ends, and there has to be room and space for the work to be secondary, or at least just from your perspective, not the main focal point. And so that's why we have this day of Shabbos, this year of Shemitah, to remind you that work is not the end all and be all. Even though most of us will spend the majority of our life working more than anything else, right? We're going to be working more than we're doing, other than maybe sleeping, right? And probably even more than sleeping, but it's close, right? Between sleeping and working, those are probably the main two things we do, I guess, and eating. Those are probably the main three things we do. But the point is that those mundane things are not the main thing. They're important, and you're going to do them. But there is this extra day, which is actually, or this extra year, which helps us to remember that there is a greater purpose, a grander purpose to our lives as well. Okay. The Orach Chaim, so the Keres Yitzchak was Spanish. The Orach Chaim was arguably one of the greatest Moroccan rabbis. A couple of hundred years later, the Keres Yitzchak, I think, is operating in around the 1400s, the 15th century, and I think the Orach Chaim is in the 1700s. So the Orach Chaim is a parish on the Chumash as well, and the Orach Chaim says as follows. Matinu ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu gila hadavar b'ma shenamar, she'amar, b'aseret hadibros, ki shesh yamim asa Hashem hashmayim v'aretz. And this, by the way, this Orach Chaim is connected to the Shem Shmuel. I noted earlier that you find a lot of parallels between Shabbos and Shemitah in different ways of discussing the same issue, right? We saw the Akeios Yitzchak kind of conflate them. We saw others kind of connect the two. So the Orach Chaim is kind of the Shabbos basis, and then we'll see the Shem Shmuel, the second Sukkot Shavuot Rebbe, who is from even later, I think, 19th century. And so the Shem Shmuel is going to apply a very similar concept. The Orach Chaim first created from Shabbos, he's going to apply it to Shemitah. We'll see that in a second. So Matzinu ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu gila davar hazeh shne'amar Amar, because God revealed in the Aseres HaDebros, ki shesh yamim asa Hashem es hashamayim ve'es ha'aretz, haregila ki b'shas habriya, in the time of creation, lo bara Hashem koach ba'olam zulas lamod, sheshes yamim, l't'am hanoda lo ki gam yadua liyode emes. So when God created the world, he only created the world to last for 6 days. And people who know the truth, they understand that that's fundamentally how God created the world. It was only going to last for 6 days. Finit chacham Hashem uvara yom echad hu yadua laHashem uvo yom chozer Hashem mashpia nefesh liolam. And then God added, was smartly, this extra day, which gave soul, which gave feeling, emotion, spirituality to the world. And shir hamekayim od sheshes yamim v'chein. And this day basically sustained the world and allowed the world to last for another 6 days, followed by another Shabbos, which allowed the world to last another 6 days, followed by a Shabbos. And so his argument is, if not for this day of Shabbos, the world would be destroyed. The Gemara after 6 days, and would have gone back to chaos. And so basically, he needed to reestablish the world through Shabbos on a weekly basis. That this is the Shabbos that kind of is between the two work weeks, right? Between every 6 days, you have your Shabbos. Now, again, this is a spiritual concept that I am reporting on. I have no comment. It's above my pay grade. I don't know how the Orach Chaim knew it, but I take his word for it. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about. And it's just interesting to kind of play that notion and knock it around in your back of your head that God created the world to only last for 6 days, and then Shabbos gave us another 6 days, and then Shabbos gave us another 6 days. It's interesting to think about. Okay, so the Shem Shmuel does a similar thing with Shemitah. It says the Shem Shmuel, and this is translated in English. The original was in Hebrew, but this was easier. It must be said that assigning the land of Israel to Israel is like creation in general. The land was given to them only for 7 years to work it. And then he gives it again for another 7 years to be worked and cared for. Therefore, in the 7th year, the land reverts to God who gave it, and all who eat from its fruit partake from its lofty table. Therefore, the introduction, when you enter the land that I assign you, is in the present tense to indicate that the act of giving you the land is continuous, not once for all time. And so he's basically says a very similar thing, that Eretz Yisrael was only given to us in 6-year intervals. And then in the 7th year, it's given back to God, and God then gives it to us for another 6 years. It's very poetic. I'm not sure exactly what the practical difference is, whether God gave it to us once or not, but it creates this really interesting kind of way of seeing how God interacts with the world through Shabbos and through Shemitah, that these are meant to be basically spiritual charging stations, right? That recharge the world and allow the world to last for another week or another 6 years, right? And it's very interesting. It's an interesting way or imagery to think about Shmita that I had never seen before until tonight yesterday when I was preparing for tonight's class. And lastly, just kind of I would say reinforcing this concept, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Lamantet Amen Aleph 39a says, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael Zaro Sheish V'Shmitu Sheva. You plan for 6, you rest for the 7th. Kadesh Tedu Sha'aret Shalihi, so that you know the land ultimately belongs to me. So let me just summarize and conclude. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to be doing the laws of Shemitah. But before we can do the laws of Shemitah, I felt that it was necessary to take a little bit of time to answer what many Rishonim, Achronim dealt with, which is the tam, the reason, that extra taste and flavor that we can get behind the mitzvah of Shemitah. And fundamentally, you have a couple of different ways to skin this mitzvah down and understand the layers. Number one, Shmita at its core is a very interesting mitzvah that allows us to work on some of our own personal midot. We can work on being a vatran, being someone who's able to let go, right? In general, if we're able to let go of our land for a full year, it will help us in our personal lives be able to let go when things don't necessarily go the way that we initially hoped. It also helps us not get too big-headed, not think, oh, well, look at me, I'm so special, I'm the chosen people, look at me. No. Ultimately, the being chosen people comes with responsibility, and God reminds us of that by taking the land back every 7 years. Is not for you to be right big-headed and think I'm so special and powerful. Absolutely not. That's for God. Number two is that Shmita provides us with a really powerful tool to both demonstrate and to reinforce our faith. To go a full year in an agricultural society without working the land and not buying and selling fruits and vegetables is pretty insane. And the fact that this is something that has been done by some is really a heroic act. We also saw that there's a little bit of a historical note here, that there was a time period in the medieval ages after Aristotle had put this theory together that the world was eternal, that the medieval commentators spent some time trying to think about which mitzvot were meant to help us reinforce the fact that God is the creator and that God ultimately created the world at some point. And so it's not an eternal thing. It's something that had a beginning. And Shemitah, the fact that we give back our land, the fact that we have these sevens all over the place as a reminder to the fact that ultimately God is the one who's calling the shots, is meant to, again, correct that wrong impression. We saw also that the concept of Shabbos, the concept of Shemitah, may in fact be the rechargeable batteries of the world, that between every single 6 days and every single 6 years, we need that seventh day or that seventh year in order for God to basically create or re-allow us to take that next step in the world that we live in. And hopefully we can take this year, even though we're not in Eretz Yisrael, and we can try to harness that spiritual strength that Shemitah creates, and every Shabbos as well, right? Try to see Shabbos as a spiritual rejuvenation for ourselves, and hopefully in the weeks to come, we'll deal with some of the more technical halachic aspects of the mitzvah of Shemitah and how it applies in 2021. I'll stop here for any thoughts or questions.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Sure.
Are there any prayers associated with Shmita? I don't see any in our prayer book here, but are there any special like daily prayers in the land of Israel during Shmita or leading into Shmita?
It's an excellent question. Other than the sections of the Torah, like in Parshas Bahar and other places where Shmita is dealt with, I don't know of any tefillot associated with Shmita. I'm going to look though, because I think it's an interesting question. What you find a lot more of these days in Israel is all host of ways to try to circumvent the issue of Shemitah, right, with technology. There's lots of really interesting ways that they try to avoid the normal ways of growing things. And with technology, more and more, there's ways of doing this. So it's interesting. I realized somebody put something into the chat. Oh, okay. So, right. So again, I made this comment at the beginning, and I'm going to make it again now. If anybody in January, Rabbi Zach is planning on doing a class earlier on Tuesday nights, and I'm considering moving my class from Tuesday to either Monday or Thursday night instead. And so trying to figure out if those nights work for everybody or not. Or if you prefer for it to stay on Tuesday, and there could just be back-to-back classes. I don't know how many people here are going to be going to both, but we can communicate that outside of this. I saw Fred commented, but anybody who wants to let me know, you can send me an email, and I'll keep it in mind when we try and figure out the schedule post January. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
very
night.
much. Be well.
Have a great night.
Thank